I'm Ben Sawyer, and this is The Road to Now. Today, a throwback treat for you, our live recording from Cat's Cradle in January of 2020. This show was a blast. The guests were Molly Worthen of UNC's History Department, Doug Heye, who you know from everything political, good friend of the show, and Rufus Edmisten, who I gotta say, on an all-star lineup, probably was the biggest star. The man worked for Senator Sam Ervin. He handed the subpoena for the Watergate tapes over to the Nixon White House. And man, the topic is charisma in American politics, and you couldn't have had a better guest for this. This show was so much fun, and as we're coming up on our live show at the Hamilton Live in Washington, D.C. on May 29th, just thought it would be nice to share this great episode and remind everybody how much fun these live shows are. Again, the tickets for our live show, May 29th in D.C., are still on sale. There's a link in the episode description, or you can just go to rtnpod.me/listen, and the links are there. And while we're on the topic, one of the things that Bob and I sometimes don't do so well is to promote the things that we do aside from the podcast. So I'm going to do that now. If you're coming through Nashville right now, I run a couple of comedy shows here, and I'm really excited because my comedy game show, Perfect Timing, is kicking back off over at Zany's Nashville in the Lab. We got shows right now, May 22nd and June 12th. If you're in the area, come check it out. It is so much fun. 3 teams of stand-up comics, and I write the show, host the show, produce the show, do everything. And it's a blast. So come to that, or check out my comedy showcase every month at Yazoo Brewing Company, first Fridays. That is no cover. They take good care of us there. You can find all my comedy dates on SawyerComedy.com, and I'm heading out to California this summer, so probably get some dates out there too. So stay tuned. For the Avett Brothers, the band that I love, that Bob is in, they got some great shows coming up. Richmond, Virginia on Thursday, May 8th. Huntsville, Alabama on Saturday, May 10th. Our show is May 29th. Then the Avett Brothers are playing Wolf Trap in Vienna, Virginia, just outside of D.C. on May 30th and 31st. You can find all that at theavettbrothers.com. If you have not seen this band, they put on an incredible show. And Bob's not here, so he doesn't know what I'm saying. I'm being honest with you. They put on an incredible show. I've seen those guys evolve over the years, and I just don't know that there's anybody who could put more into what they do than the Avett Brothers. So go check them out, or come check me out, or come check us out. All the links are in the episode description. And finally, thanks to the patrons, patreon.com/theroadtonow. Patrons, you keep the show going. Every time we go to pay out the bills, it's like, whew, thank goodness for those guys. So we do appreciate what you do for us. Without further ado, hope you guys enjoy this conversation as much as I did listening back to it. I was laughing out loud sitting by myself as I was editing this up. Enjoy our conversation from Carrboro, North Carolina, back in 2020 when we had a whole tour planned across the country for the rest of the year, and something happened. Something I can't remember. Here's to better days, guys. Enjoy the show.
Our first guest is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina. That's right down the street, by the way. She's also an opinion writer for the New York Times, the author of 2 books, and a soon-to-be-released lecture on audible.com about charismatic leaders who remade America. Please welcome Molly Worthen. Molly, welcome. You were a guest on our podcast several years ago talking about your book, Apostles of Reason, about American evangelicals, history of American evangelicals. This latest project is about charismatic leaders. When I think about American leaders with charisma, I think about George Washington, Teddy Roosevelt, Martin Luther King. To be a charismatic leader is as much about the person and what they exude as it is about the times in which they live.
I think that's one of the central questions. That's a question that has preoccupied almost everybody who has studied or paid attention to this issue of leadership and why it works when it does and what happens when it doesn't work. And I think when we use the term charisma, we are really focused on the individual. It's a term we kind of punt to when we don't actually know what's going on, when people in front of us seem to be falling for ideas we may think are crazy, And there's some kind of ineffable thing. When you think about the language people use, it's often metaphorical. They talk about magnetism, a speaker bewitching an audience. I think it's helpful to throw out some sort of working definition of what we're talking about.
Okay.
My working definition is that charisma is an irresistible allure that gives a leader the power to move a crowd. And that's kind of a riff, I think, on the definition that percolated into American English in the second half of the 20th century, really from this one thinker, a sociologist named Max Weber, who borrowed this word, which had really been a kind of fusty theological term used only in church history and discussions of the New Testament, and imported it into conversations about politics to try to put his finger on this almost theological thing, this sense that individuals have a supernatural, heroic set of abilities. However, he was quick to point out that their abilities go up in smoke if their followers lose faith, that this individual is no longer the anointed. So I really think charisma is a social experience, always.
Do charismatic leaders have a life cycle other than, life on earth? But I mean, do they tend to peter out at some point?
Either they peter out or they figure out a way to institutionalize their charisma. They build a church so that their sect, their movement goes on beyond the life of one individual. Or they adjust themselves to use rather other tools of authority like legal institutions, the institutions of politics. If they don't do that, it's pretty hard for that power to be anything other than ephemeral.
It seems interesting the way that charisma works, and it seems to defy logic sometimes. George Wallace is this fascinating character, not only because he is able to bizarrely bring together these groups from all over the country, but because when you look at the people that supported him, Jeff Cowley's great book on the 70s, he talks about how people that supported Wallace immediately were supporting McGovern. And that to me makes no sense.
Right, and how Robert F. Kennedy's supporters went to Wallace after he was assassinated.
Yeah, and this all is like interesting, and it reminds us now about, we had a conversation on the podcast last week with Matt Negrin, and he was like, there can't be anybody who voted for Obama twice and then voted for Trump. But we know that there are. Do you think charisma helps explain how these things happen?
Maybe it does, and maybe it also shows us the limitations of charisma as a category for understanding leaders and their success and reactions of followers. If you think about the 1968 election, which is what you're talking about, the one unifying factor between those supporters of Bobby Kennedy and Wallace and McCarthy was hatred of Lyndon B. Johnson, right? So that was the main glue. That was the thing that fired them up more than anything, I think, what they resented and hated, whether it was Vietnam, whether it was big government reaching in and forcing integration. And so I think that's part of what explains that fluidity. And maybe it compels us to step back and not attach quite so much significance to the power of the individual. At the same time, part of charisma is having a kind of genius, an ability to read a political moment and see what's called for. I mean, Wallace was an incredible pragmatist. Of course, in 1958, when he first ran for governor, he ran as a moderate and lost and learned his lesson. And so what is that? Is that charisma? Is that simply a political, tactical decision? Is it both? What it has to be is partly an ability to read the fears and anxieties of the people you're trying to reach. And I see Donald Trump as being also ingenious at this. I think what people crave more than political solutions is simply the feeling that their suffering has meaning, that someone important sees their fear and what keeps them up at night. Wallace was able to do that, and I think that's been really critical to Trump's success as well.
So then, is it fair to say that there are two types of charisma? Because I think about, you're right, the people that go, I hear you, you're right, you're upset, there's reasons for it, I'll offer you a pretty simple explanation of it, and I'll get you behind me. And then there are the people that I see on TV who are like, live your best life, and I'm like, I feel okay, right? And then they're like, get up, you lazy thing. That's not what they're saying, but that's what it sounds like to me. And I feel like I'm kind of at an okay base level, and then they motivate me to go further, right? So do you think, is that fair to say that there are two things, or maybe I'm just inspired by the fear of my own self? I don't know.
I think you've captured the duality of Donald Trump's political success in what you've just said, because his other great ability is the way he's really a high priest of the Church of Positive Thinking. I mean, he went for nearly 60 years. He attended the mega church, essentially, of the prosperity gospel, Marble Collegiate Church in Manhattan. His family pastor was Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking in the 1950s. That's actually the orthodoxy he was steeped in as a young person and for much of his adult life. And you see it, in the old ads for Trump University and the kind of imaginary fantasy world that he's able to spin out even today for his followers. So I think you're absolutely right. It's this combination of recognizing your fears and your terrors, recognizing, too, your need to be told that you have the ability to pull yourself out of it, while also retaining the comfort of being a victim. That's the genius.
You talked about Norman Vincent, say that name again.
Norman Vincent Peale.
Thank you. Makes me think of Dale Carnegie as well. Could you talk about Dale Carnegie a little bit in this charismatic milieu?
I've been really interested in Dale Carnegie in my research because I've been trying to suss out this tradition of thinkers and motivational speakers who argue that charisma can be taught. Charisma is not some inborn, ineffable thing that either you have or you don't. It's actually a discrete set of learned skills. Carnegie was very much one of these.
I just want to jump in and say this is the guy who wrote the book, How to Make Friends and Influence People.
That's right. Yeah, in 1936.
Right.
Yeah, he got his start. He was a poor kid from Missouri and went to college thinking he'd be a school teacher, got really interested in public speaking, made his way to New York, was very interested in acting, studied what was kind of in vogue in acting schools in the day and really trying to inhabit emotions and things like this. But then got his big break when the YMCA let him start teaching public speaking at night to whoever wanted to take public speaking classes. And he stumbled at first, but figured out ways to energize his students by forcing them on their feet and forcing them to confront their fears. And then he made his big bucks distilling these insights on how to not just give public addresses, but how to really read other people in business situations and friend situations to get what you want, essentially. So a lot of his advice is about learning how to flatter the other person without it seeming that way, or if you're having a disagreement, how to subtly give your interlocutor a way to change his or her mind without realizing that's what they're doing. And I've really wondered the degree to which these kinds of skills he's describing are or aren't connected to charisma with a capital C on the stage leading a mass movement. Are these aspects that we might rather call personal charm? Or are they really also intrinsic to the ability to fire up a big crowd? Because there certainly are cases of leaders who inspired mass movements who, from what we can tell, they weren't particularly nice people to be around. Actually, Eugene McCarthy apparently was not the nicest guy. People who knew him personally found him really difficult. So I've wondered about this. But that idea that you can learn charisma, whether or not you think it's true, it certainly is so appealing that it's made loads of money, and it's become, I think in a way, a major part of business school curricula, teaching these leadership skills.
Yeah, if you've ever been in a store with a salesperson or on the phone and they just keep on saying your first name over and over and over and over and over again, they read that book, but they didn't quite get it.
So are we to understand that Donald Trump knows what he's doing? Is he crazy, or is he crazy like a fox?
I've struggled with this. I think there are some ways in which he's very conscious and other ways in which he's just been very lucky. So his family, grew up in that church I described, Norman Vincent Peale's church. He didn't make a tactical decision he didn't realize that it is one of the, if not the most prominent spiritual stream in America, although it is. In other ways, he is such a pragmatist, such a deal maker, that he's been able to win over conservative white evangelicals in such huge numbers because he's simply willing to treat the things they want as bargaining chips. The number of issues that he really cares about besides his own ego is a very short list, I think. He doesn't actually care about the Supreme Court, so he's willing to do this trading, and that comes out of his tactical mindset, I think.
A great example of this is the March for Life. Republican presidents have been courting the March for Life crowd since Reagan. And they would always court the crowd, and then once they won election, they have this march in Washington every January. But the Republican president who wanted these people to vote for him would never show up at the march. He would address them by telephone, by satellite transmission, but he would never go and press the flesh, so to speak. Well, Donald Trump went, the first president ever to go, and that meant so much to those people. And he's delivering on something they've always wanted. But he probably doesn't really believe in what drives them to be at the march in the first place.
Right, he has a history of changing his mind on that particular question. But of course, he made his megastar name as a TV star. He's a guy who does have a real instinct for the scene, the theater of politics. This was something that was part of Ronald Reagan's genius as well. I mean, Reagan, of course, came out of Hollywood, and he talked very openly with his advisors and colleagues about crafting the perfect scene in the Rose Garden for a particular announcement and thinking about the staging. He thought very explicitly in those terms. And I think Trump does to some extent as well. He recognized the March for Life as one of these opportunities. He also can't resist an adoring crowd. He might be, you could argue, that he is the best example of a purely charismatic leader in American history. And what I mean by that is that he has spent really most of his free time, long after being elected president, doing these rallies and fomenting this support and feeding off the effervescent energy of his followers, much more so than drawing authority from institutions, although he's bent some of those to his will, and maybe the main institutional support he has is the conservative media. But I'm really struck by how his authority seems to have this charismatic quality that is quite different from other presidents.
I remember we interviewed Margaret Talev several years ago. She covers the White House. She did for Bloomberg at the time. And she told a story about the first time she covered Trump, or traveled with Trump, I think it was. And they're all on Air Force One. And she said she covered Obama all 8 years, and maybe 2 times he had ever come back into the room where the reporters were. And she goes with Trump, and it's like the first or second time. It's like early on, he comes back in there, and he knows most of their names, and he asks the other ones, and he's funny, and he's kind, and he kind of charms every single one of them. And they ask him, what are you going to talk about when we land? And he's kind of like, just talk about some problems we're facing. And then the plane lands, he walks off, stands in front of a crowd, and says, the media is the enemy of the people. This guy just walked out of a room with the media, charmed them, and then walked out there to a whole different audience and basically said, yeah, you're all my enemies. I mean, that's an amazing turn, right?
So given all your research about charismatic individuals, if Donald Trump were to win the next election, the 2020 November, what ways could he institutionalize his charisma?
To some extent, I don't think that it's too much to credit this to Donald Trump, but the doublethink that has characterized his administration, speaking one thing and doing another, the bald-faced lying, has already become, I'm afraid to say, pretty institutionalized because of the polarization of media. I mean, there's been a conservative media organizations for for decades and decades, but only recently have they acquired the power that they now have to totally silo off people who consume their news. And that is a phenomenon that is, of course, much bigger than Donald Trump. And this brings us back to the question of, is it the individual or is it the moment? Well, it's the right individual meeting the right moment. And I think that we are seeing the enculturating or institutionalization of some of these features of Trumpism that really will live on long past him. And that's what's most alarming about this time we're in.
Well, I think that's a great segue.
Yes, it is.
To bring out the first ever Never Trumper.
That's right. And the first ever Road to Now guest. Coincidence? Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, coming to the stage right now, CNN contributor, Wall Street Journal opinion writer, and former RNC spokesman, former chief of staff to Eric Counter, and of course the first Road to Now guest. Please welcome our good friend, Doug Heye. So, Doug, we've been talking academically about the concept of charisma and gotten some great categories from Molly about how this works, but you worked for the Republican Party for most of your adult life. Who was the most charismatic politician you ever worked for, and what made them so charismatic?
Worked for is hard. I've worked in 3 North Carolina Senate races, Jesse Helms 90, Locke Faircloth 92, and then Richard Burr 2004. Thank you for that, by the way.
Did you think it just happened? Guys. People worked on it, and they're all right people, all right?
How long's Jesse Helms been dead? I mean, come on, be nice.
2002, right.
He died.
Guys, come on.
I would say Locke Faircloth was not the most charismatic speaker that you've ever seen. And in fact, he was so bad at one event. I remember my father saying, geez, it was the debate against Terry Sanford. Geez, he wasn't really good. And I said, no, we're actually really happy with how he performed. Richard Burr connects extremely well with audiences. I worked for Michael Steele when I was the RNC chair. And one of the things that we did in 2010 was we did what we called the Fire Pelosi bus tour, which, for full disclosure, was because we thought Pelosi was really effective, which is why we wanted to fire her, right? Obamacare had passed because she got it through. And we basically put Michael Steele on a bus through 48 states. He went to all 48 of the continental United States, and he connected with audiences in everywhere from Reston, Virginia to Waco, Texas to Fargo, North Dakota. And, he had that special factor, that it factor, in a way that I hadn't seen super up close, that really helps not just convey a message, but then get people to do things. And that's ultimately, whether it's registering to vote, whether it's knocking on doors or, what have you, that's that important thing. You can have all the charisma in the world, but if you don't get somebody to then go and do something for you as a politician, it's pretty useless. But also, I think we're living right now and in the previous 8 years with, 2 of the most charismatic politicians this country's ever seen. We'll never know how charismatic John Quincy Adams really was.
Not very.
John Calhoun's hair was amazing, but beyond that, I don't think we know.
But he had to have been somewhat charismatic. Calhoun? Yes.
I mean, I guess so in his own way.
I mean, nullification.
The face you'd remember is all I could say about him.
Or to forget, yes.
Yeah, and the follow-up question to that, Doug, was going to be, who's the least charismatic politician you ever watched up close, and why? I think you already answered that, Locke Faircloth.
I mean, yeah, Faircloth didn't have a whole lot of wow factor, but he also won the race, and in '92, he was the only Republican to beat a Democratic incumbent on Election Day. Paul Coverdell eventually won in a runoff in Georgia. So which was very weird. We're at the North Raleigh Hilton election night of '92. Bush had lost, obviously, so it wasn't a great night for the Republican Party. The Faircloth campaign was celebrating, and that kind of rubbed some people the wrong way who had suffered a big loss that night.
Yeah. So we had you and Mo Alathe on a couple days before the 2016 election, and Mo had your job, the job that you had at the RNC, Mo had at the DNC. And you guys were just kind of talking about your time in politics and saying, we kind of created this mess, this unpleasant, polarized world we live in with politics. What is the most egregious attack you ever carried out on a Democrat?
I mean,
You guys gonna be okay with this?
So, I mean, I can honestly say I don't think that I've done anything too egregious. And you know, I've been fortunate in a lot of the roles that I've had where I've kind of come in. This is certainly true at the RNC. Yes, I helped lead the Fire Pelosi campaign, but and certainly working for Eric Cantor, where I was there to kind of bring some people together and to quell problems that already existed, to some extent with the Burr campaign as well. But you know, there's been this long conversation about cancel culture and things that you wouldn't do today that you did then. In 2004, NAFTA was a really big deal, and we sent out a mailer about Erskine Bowles and Richard Burr became pretty good friends after the campaign. Bowles, in fact, had said, I remember the quote very well, because I used it in subsequent campaigns, no one works smarter or harder for North Carolina than Richard Burr. And you don't really have your opponent say that very often. Bowles probably forgot that we put out a mailer on his family's textile business and how they were shipping jobs to Mexico. And in the picture, Erskine Bowles was wearing a sombrero. Not something that you would probably do in 2020.
No.
Or something you're more likely to do in 2020, depending on where you are, I think. I mean, like, hasn't that can of worms been opened back up in a lot of ways? I mean, with like the breaking in orthodoxy, I mean, recently with politics.
Well, and it does raise the issue of, is bad publicity sometimes good publicity? Because if a campaign did that, if, you know, in 2020, if Steve King did that, which he probably would, you know, it would cause outrage on the left, and in theory, that could help him.
Okay, you mentioned Steve King. You brought him up. So the question I have to ask you is, what is the Republican that you had to go out and defend that you were actually absolutely like, this guy is awful, or this woman is awful, but I have to go out in public and defend this person?
You know, again, I fortunately didn't have to do that. You know, when I was at the Republican National Committee, we dealt with a series of really unfortunate stories, including at one point a staffer had basically spent $2,000 on, and this is the difference between Washington, D.C. and California, a erotically themed nightclub in Beverly Hills, which in Washington was called a lesbian-themed bondage club. Now, when my aunt called me and she read me quoted in the story in the New York Times about that, that was a difficult conversation. But I remember having to go on TV and being very clear, yeah, we fired her and we're going to fire more people. So I haven't had to, ever defend Steve King, because I'm not going to. And there's the dynamic in House leadership is you're part of team, but it's also, 435 small businesses that all run themselves. And, there's a quote of John Boehner's about, I think it was about Steve King, but if not, somebody like him, where he had said something, I think it was Steve King. He had said something awful and racist, and he said, John Boehner, what do you think about that? And I can't repeat exactly what he said because it's a family podcast, but he was...
And my son's sitting in the front row.
Exactly. But he was very clear. Steve King, you're on your own or worse. And so I haven't had to. Mostly you get kind of stuck on issues that you wish you weren't stuck on. I didn't love doing the Benghazi Select Committee. I think we did it because we felt that we had to, because our base wanted it, more than it being, and Trey Gowdy was the perfect person for us to pick for it, but was it a real serious investigation of the facts? No.
So I'm glad you brought that up, because that goes into you, Molly. Like, how much does the base drive Trump? How much are the people are definitely creating fear for Republican senators and congressmen, right? To go along with what Trump wants to do. When he says something ridiculous, they have to go back and somehow justify what he said and make it not so ridiculous, because his followers will attack them if they don't.
Doug, your comments are making me see how complicated the appearance of an effective leader and his connection to a crowd really is, and making me wonder how much of it is spontaneous and hard to put your finger on, or driven by the instincts of the people in the audience, and how much of it actually is carefully crafted by a team of strategic thinkers who are keenly aware of all the pieces of the media machine and how to control messages, what happens when a message spins out of control, ways to simply tweak the presentation of a leader who maybe didn't quite hit a home run and turn it into that. How much does that, that evasive relationship between the follower and the individual politician really matter, and how much of it is being controlled, engineered, shaped by people like you?
Yeah, well, and also, there's a bottom up on it, as well, and a top down. I've long maintained, since Trump's elected, that he is actually in a very unique place to do things that a President Marco Rubio or Scott Walker or Jeb Bush wouldn't have been allowed to do. I think Donald Trump could cut a deal on guns that none of the three that I mentioned could, or on immigration. And you wouldn't think Trump could cut a gun deal or an immigration deal, especially because of the things that he said on immigration. That's why I think he has that ability, because he can go to his base and say, there's that T-shirt a good friend of mine has, or it's a sleeveless T-shirt that says Obama can't ban these guns, right? Well, the flip side of that message is those voters.
Hire some better writers.
Right, you have one of those, I'm sure. The flip side of that is Donald Trump's voters would say, if Trump says, I'm not going to take your guns, they're going to believe him. If Trump cuts the deal with Pelosi and Schumer and gets Republican member buy-in, which he would, on immigration, they'd go along with him, because the Republican Trump voter is going to say, well, he's building the wall, so this must be a good deal. And he's the greatest negotiator in the history of the world, which also then helps him, right?
So how about a public service announcement? So last week, my wife called Tom Tillis's office. Now, I've called Tom Tillis's office many times since 2016, and I always get a machine. And she got a human being, and he was very nice, and she said what she had to say, and he listened, and he was cordial, and whatever. So then I was like, really? So
Can I ask, local office or Washington office?
No, D.C.
Okay.
So I've called the local Tom Tillis offices, and I'm like, I'm Bob from the Avett Brothers, and oh my gosh, kids in cages. What are you guys doing? What's wrong with him? Because, I've worked with Tillis, through you and people on his staff for CBD oil and things that we care for. Our friend Brent Coburn.
Yeah.
He when I met him, we talked about this idea of each of us is a special interest group of one, right? We all have our top 3 things that mean the most to us in life, things that we're afraid of, the things that it could be your job, it could be healthcare, it could be schools. For us, it's healthcare, disabilities, cancer, things like that. So you realize, even if you're not political, when your world is impacted, you're going to become political, right? So I met people from Tillis's office. They were really nice, and we worked on the CBD thing a little bit. And so then when the first one was Betsy DeVoe and things she was doing with disabled children in schools, and then of course the horrible situation at the border. So I would call his office in D.C. and I would get a machine. I'm like, hey, this is Bob from the Avett Brothers. What the hell are you doing? And then I started calling the local offices. And I could tell the guy who answered the phone, who was probably 18 years old, was just holding the...
I'm sorry, sir. I'm really sorry about this.
Not even, just a little yeah, okay, whatever. But anyway, so then I called the D.C. office, and I got a young lady. And she was, again, I just started... when you start talking and you don't even know what you start saying stupid things because you're just on a roll and you're talking? Well, I was like, I wanted him to vote for witnesses in the impeachment. And then I'm talking yeah, because I know Tom Tillis. I know this guy who worked for him. I love Tom. So I actually said that. I actually said I love Tom. And then I was like, what's wrong with Mike Pence being president? I just started saying all these ridiculous, crazy things. Anyway.
Go on with that.
So for you, Doug, you have experience. That was so long-winded.
You know how when you're talking and talking and talking and talking and talking?
If anyone here wants to call, they have an issue, they want to call their representative in Washington, what happens? Does it matter? What's the best way to do it?
Yeah. One, it absolutely matters, whether it's a phone call, an email, even tweets now. But direct contacts are the best way to do it. I would say definitely call the local office. Frankly, the Capitol switchboard or the 225 number in the House or the 224 number in the Senate, they all have that kind of the same prefixes. They are overrun. They're overrun with robocalls. And so in that office, so Richard Burr's office, you walk in and there are 3 desks, and those people are answering phones and they're greeting people who walk in. And they're dealing with phones that are nonstop ringing a lot of times because of robocalls of pick your issue and pick your side of the issue. We're flooding the Capitol with phone calls. So call the Raleigh office, call the Winston-Salem office, call the Charlotte office, whatever's closest to you. And then you're really dealing with people who are neighbors, who will be better able to listen to you a little bit longer. But they pay close attention to not only what are people calling in about, because if you see 6 or 7 really organic phone calls on an issue or emails on an issue that you didn't know was really perking up, that's what gets your attention.
So I'm going to rehabilitate Doug's reputation with all of you, okay? So he was the first never Trumper, and he still is.
He was.
Come on, you booed the guy a minute ago.
Well, look, so I'll be honest, I still don't know what never Trump means. And, for me, it meant...
Well, what about never, never Trump?
See, well, then it's like double dog dare, right? And
Twice as much.
Like, for me, it meant there's no chance that I vote for this guy in November of 2016, which I didn't. But I remember, in the days leading up to the convention, an ex-colleague of mine who still is really a good friend was like, we need you in Cleveland to block Trump at the convention. And I said, that is the worst idea I've ever heard of. He's like, what do you mean? And I said, well, Trump has won fair and square. And the only thing worse than Trump being our nominee is blocking him after he's won fair and square. And, so I still don't know what it means. What would surprise you is most of what this administration does, I'm pretty on board with. The tweets are not good. Threatening NATO is not good. Everything that we're watching right now with Ukraine, really not good. But if we want to talk about the Department of Interior, I'll probably not make a lot friends.
We're all friends here. Are we all friends here?
We are all friends here. There were not many people who said okay. So I will say that...
If we were in Alamance County, I'd be making a lot more friends than in Orange County, right? Let's go to Mebane. We can do this.
Well, what I love about Doug, too, is Bob asked him, if he ever had to defend somebody that, was the hardest person to defend. You weren't sent out there to defend him, but I remember watching CNN after you got hired as their kind of resident conservative, and people be on there laying into you about Trump, and you'd be like, yeah. And being like, yeah, I think they thought he was supposed to defend him, but you're like, yes, I can't say I agree with you, but I do. I felt bad for you, Doug. So,
I got so many questions, but let's move on because our next guest was the Deputy Chief Counsel for the Senate Watergate Committee. He was Attorney General and Secretary of State of North Carolina and the 1984 Democratic nominee for governor of this state. Please welcome Rufus Edmisten. You've run so many campaigns.
That means I've run so many times, I'm now a recovering politician. I'm about the 29th step out of 30 steps on the way to recovering. And I know why you invited me tonight, because you wanted to see a real live politician who is an egomaniac. That's your charisma, Molly. A total egomaniac. It explains most of it for all of us. But I was thinking the other day how lucky I am to know people like Bob Crawford. He's a Carolina fan. I don't know what's happened to us, but when you're a politician, you like to have supplicants. You like to have people holding onto your every word, and you need to be knocked down occasionally. Well, this year at the state fair, I was out there and I was walking among the crowd, and this woman said, "Are you who I think you are?" Oh my God, that could be anybody. I said, "Well, who do you think I am?" She says, "Ain't you Rufus?" I said, "Well, yeah." She said, "Hell, I thought you were dead." It's good, Doug, to be invited anywhere, anytime when you're a recovering politician, and especially the Cat's Cradle, because it's a relatively smart group. It's not your usual dummies. No. Why are you looking at me that way?
I think he is one of the dummies. He doesn't fit in. He's just realized that.
Well, Rufus, in your book, and Rufus has a book, everybody. It's called That's Rufus, a memoir of Tar Heel politics, Watergate, and public life. Pick it up. It's great.
I highly recommend it. I highly recommend it.
So,
And you can see what an ego is on steroids in this
So-
book.
in your book, you confess that. So Rufus walked the subpoena for the Nixon tapes to the front door of the White House. He was the chief counsel for the Senate Watergate Committee under Sam Ervin, Senator Ervin.
Correct.
And no
North
one,
Carolina hero, Sam Ervin.
that's right. The funny thing, when I was reading that part of your book, is no one asked you to do that.
They're like, where is that subpoena?
You're like,
where's Rufus?
Hey, are you done with that subpoena? Because I'm going to take it down there.
Well, why do you think my title was Deputy Chief Counsel? And I decided that somebody had to serve subpoena, so why not myself?
I mean, that was the beginning of your political career, and that was a bold move. What did Sam Ervin think about that?
Well, a lot of you youngsters are out here, you don't remember Watergate, and I know maybe these old codgers over here do, but John Dean had come before the committee, the Watergate Committee, and said that Richard Nixon was into it up to his eyeballs. Well, that was going to be a confrontation between Nixon's word and John Dean's word. Well, about 2 days later, a man came before the committee in executive session whose name was Alexander Butterfield. And Alexander Butterfield was, as far as we were concerned, just a sort of a non-person. We called him up there because we wanted to know, well, who's in charge of this? Who's in charge of that? Well, when under questioning from a very smart lawyer named Gene Boyce of Raleigh, North Carolina, on our staff, he said, Mr. Butterfield, do you know of any taping system in the White House? Butterfield paused. This was the biggest question of the century. And said, yes, there is, very hesitatingly. And then it was our job, when he broke that loose, we would say, okay, we will finally know whether or not John Dean is telling the truth if we can get our hands on the tape. So the committee met in private in Senator Ervin's office, and they were talking to one another about how are we going to get a hold of the tapes. And Senator Ervin said, well, why don't we just call the president and have a little talk with him? And he said to me, well, Rufus, go get the president on the phone, sort of like go get a loaf of bread while you're at it. So I went to a little anteroom, and I dialed up the White House, and I had Rosemary Wood's number, and she's the lady that was accused of doing the 18-minute gap in the taping system. And I said, Ms. Wood, this is Rufus Edmisten. I said, what's your first name? She said, that's a strange name. And I said, well, I don't know how my mom and daddy could have given me a name like that, but that's my name. I said, Rufus L. Edmisten, the Deputy Chief Counsel of the Senate Watergate Committee. And she said, well, hold on, I'll be right back. Now, remember, in the meantime, President Nixon had been saying all along, the committee is out to get me. The committee's out to get me. Well, that was Nixon saying that. Well, this voice came on the phone. It wasn't Rosemary Wood. It was the president. He said, Senator Ervin, this is Richard Nixon. Well, I was so taken back that all of a sudden I said, Mr. President, hold on. Senator Ervin wants to get you on the phone. So I told the President of the United States of America that we wanted to get him. And then when I got back into the committee room, the committee voted to subpoena the president, the first time in history the committee of the Congress had ever subpoenaed the president, and now they fly around like confetti just everywhere with nobody paying any attention to them. And by the way, not one time do I remember, Doug or Molly, that anybody refused a Watergate subpoena, which is quite a contrast with today. But anyway, I decided on my own that somebody had to take that subpoena down there, and I did. And I went in, the police car rolled up, the Capitol police car, you know how they are with a back with a big screen in it. And I got in there, and my mama said after I'd taken it to the White House, she said, well, he went down there in the back of a police car one time for a good cause. Why are you looking at me like that? Anyway, I went down there and I read the subpoena out to let's see, you'll know this name, He was the counsel to the president at that time. He had about one a week because when he would ask them to do something, he would fire them if they didn't do what he wanted them to do. And I did this little mischievous trick of a 31-year-old smart aleck from Watauga County, Boone, North Carolina. Woo! Anybody here from Watauga County? Hallelujah. Good for you. Watauga means land of beautiful waters in Cherokee Indian language. Bet you didn't know that, did you? Okay. But anyway, was carrying around one of these little constitutions in my back pocket, and when I served the subpoena and I read it all out very formally, I said, you folks might need one of these too while you're at it. So I popped that subpoena out on them right down there. So that's the story of a long way around of carrying the subpoena to the White House. And again, I want to recommend this book. It's all in there. And by the way, the proceeds go to a thing called the Extra Super Kids, where we take kids who've overcome adversity and we say to them, if you stay in school, you stay straight, we'll help you go to college. And we have 39 graduates now that's been going on for that. So all profits go to that. Now, I'm sure you want to say something since it's your program.
That story, Rufus, that story you were telling was riveting. I think you guys don't know how it ended, so you'll need to buy the book to find out how the story of Nixon wrapped up. Anyway, so what's interesting to me is that your term, you've been a Democrat your whole life. Again, you're from the mountains, but your career went through a period where the South was solidly Democrat. My aunt told me you couldn't get a job in North Carolina in 1970 unless you were a Democrat. And then suddenly, a couple decades later, you end up, it's the Republican Party. What was it like living through that? What did you see?
It started with the Nixon strategy, which was a pretty smart strategy to divide the South. And I can recall I was talking to the wonderful Childers, Mr. Childers, that played for in the beginning. His father was my campaign manager in Gaston County. Well, Gaston County hasn't voted Democratic in a long time, but back then, every county in North Carolina, with the exception of Wilkes and Sampson and a few like that in the 60s and early 70s, voted Democratic. It all started changing when Nixon became president, because he was a magnificent politician, by the way. He may have had a lot of flaws, but this man had his own charisma. And he wasn't the prettiest guy in the world. And I've noticed that your definitions of charisma were not all beautiful, wonderful sounding people. And some of them, like Sam Irvin, didn't look so pretty. But it's just how you have people wanting you to say things that they want to hear. And Richard Nixon knew how to do it. Law and order, law and order. The country was in turmoil. Remember that we were fighting in Vietnam. The country... Oh, my goodness, we had recent assassination of President Kennedy, recent assassination of Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King. The country was in turmoil, and Nixon knew how to play that, and playing it right for the right audience, in my mind, is a form of charisma. Now, you take another person that I admire greatly, is Bill Clinton. I would have people say to me, I can't stand Bill Clinton. I'd say, well, I had one guy one time, when I was Secretary of State, whichever it was, we got invited to the White House to go down there, and this Secretary of State from the state of Washington said, I don't want to go see that SOB. And I said, well, just come on. Well, he went down there to the White House, and the president came in and gave what was supposed to be a 10-minute talk, and it turned out to be 45 minutes, because he could talk, as you know, Doug. And after it was over, this Secretary of State of the state of Washington said to me, you can't help but like that son of a gun. And that's just the kind of person he was. And we have bad charisma and good charisma. If it moves people, I think right now, I didn't hear part of what you said, Doug, because I was back there.
You weren't listening?
I was listening, but I was singing along with Mr. Childers a little bit. And yes. Was that a question?
He's getting ready to pull his album up, too, and be like, I've also got one of those to say.
I dropped my thought. Go ahead, pepper me again.
You and Bill Clinton were friends.
Yes,
right?
we were friends, and I was invited one time to spend the night in the Lincoln bedroom, which is in the book. It's a whole chapter.
It was the longest night ever.
But Bill Clinton and I met one another when he was Attorney General of Arkansas. I was Attorney General of North Carolina. And we would get together, and when he first announced for president, I came out for him. And he was just a phenomenal guy. When you were up front, face-to-face with that guy, he was the most charismatic person I've ever met. And I'm sure, Doug, you ran across him at times too.
Yeah.
He was extremely charismatic. That's just all there is to it. You couldn't help but like it when you were talking to him. The night that I spent in the Lincoln bedroom was awesome. I got to tell you, how many people can say they spent the night in the Lincoln bedroom? And I was there, by the way, with my own wife. I want to make that very plain. Her name is Linda H. Edmisten. She's in the book. But we rode down there in a Navy car, and these guys were in their whites, the naval personnel, and I thought my wife was going to pass out. She said, "Those are the best-looking hunks I've ever seen in my life," and she couldn't take her mind off of it. But the thing that always bothered me was that
Rufus, I love the fact that you said I was in there with my wife, and we thought you were trying to like say that you were like true to her. In fact, you were just bragging that you got to be in there with her. She tried to be in there with somebody else, I'll tell you.
Well, now here's the thing I've always wondered about and worried about. I had to go up on Capitol Hill that night after we checked into the White House, and I was gone for 3 hours. Well, I said, "Honey, what'd you do while you were down here?" And I said, "Was the president here?" I said, "Did you get to talk with him a little bit here and there?" She said, "We had a very pleasant conversation." I said, "Go on." She says, "I will keep my own conscience to what we did, but it was a very pleasant conversation between two people from Arkansas." That's all she'd tell me. And I asked her today, she says, go figure it out.
Did you? Is it in the book?
I'm a very trusting husband.
Did you ever think that Bill Clinton's charisma would get him in trouble?
Yes, yes. I did figure it'd get him in trouble. It's gotten me in trouble before. I can tell you that because, political life can get you thinking that it's called ego. It's called that Greek word. What's that Greek word that I use all the time?
Hubris.
Hubris. It's called hubris.
It's in the book.
Yeah, it's in the book. You get to thinking that you are in a different world because people they really want something from you, and you get to thinking you're in another world. You sort of swoon. The crowd energizes you. You get a big kick out of it, and it's hard to get lost, and it's real easy to slip over into hubris, and that is not a characteristic only allotted to political life. Academia, schoolwork, the religious profession. You go back and you see anybody who's had a grand downfall, it's because they let hubris take over, thinking that nobody sees you. The old boy in Boone one time, I was using the word hubris, and he said, "Well, I don't know what that really is," but he said it's sort of like the drunk that goes in. The first thing he does, the first stage of that there hubris that you're talking about, is he said, "I'll buy everybody in the bar a drink." So the second stage of that is he thinks he's the most beautiful person in the world, and is primping and putting his eyebrows in place and this and that. And he said the third and the most dangerous one is you think you're invisible, and that's my definition of hubris. And it infects every politician, and some can control it, some can't. I had my downfall. It's certainly in the book. I didn't leave that out. And you've got to totally get back and let your wife or your husband get a hold of you for a while and set you straight. and say that you're not as smart as you think you are and you're not as cute as you think you are. And you may have this round face, like the News Observer one time referred to me, and they said, the moon-faced Edmisten. And I used to wonder, did they mean a crescent moon, or did they mean a half moon, or a full moon, or what kind of damn moon did they mean?
I could listen to him all night. Let's just do this all night. I could have this conversation all night long.
I wanted to, I mean, just because Molly's here and like you're a scholar, you're an expert on this. I don't know if you had any questions for Rufus, or did he answer them, or it's in the book, maybe.
I'm definitely ordering this book. Yes. I was thinking as you were talking about hubris about another Greek word, charis, the root Greek word for charisma, which meant originally, when the ancient Greeks used it, a gift bestowed on humans by the gods for good or for ill, usually with some kind of unexpected curse that comes with the blessing. So if you think about Cassandra having the gift of prophecy, but no one listens to her, or Pandora getting to open this box, but then all this terrible stuff comes out, there's always this ugly side, this side you can't control. And I'm racking my brains thinking whether there's any leader, certainly any charismatic leader, who doesn't have a giant ego, and whether that's not simply a requirement for the job.
It virtually is. You have some real quiet people, but they never make much of anything for themselves. And politically, you have to have a tremendous amount of ego. And the only question is, can you control it? Can you temper down that hubris that comes along with being in public life? And occasionally you get kicked in the rear. That's all there is to it.
Can I ask you both a question? I was reading a book by Peter Drucker, the guru of management consulting, on leadership. And this is a book he wrote in the late 1980s. He has a whole chapter on charisma and how terrible it is. And he says that his favorite leaders are the ones that were just deadly dull personally. Like, he loved Eisenhower. He loved people who would just sort of get the job done and not make a big deal about it, could wear many different hats. And certainly we can think of many leaders who've been elected to highest office. I mean, Herbert Hoover would not have become president if charisma was actually a requirement for being elected president. So I'm wondering, is it really an asset on balance, given its dark side, and how necessary is it for political effectiveness?
For Donald Trump and Barack Obama, it was and is absolutely an asset. And you can look at other people who had great moments in politics where their charisma is what got them to the table and kept them alive for a while. And to some extent, we're going to find out if this is somewhat of an anti-charisma year, if folks want to return to normalcy, however we define that. But Barack Obama set people on fire. And that was his charisma that did it. That's what drove it. It's part of why he won North Carolina, which he wasn't supposed to do. Donald Trump turned the Republican Party on its head, which he wasn't supposed to do, in part because, we still can't, if you love him or hate him, and Bob and Ben, we've talked about this. I view Donald Trump to some extent as a bad guy professional wrestler. And if you want to cheer him, you cheer him. If you want to boo him, you boo him. But you keep watching. And you show up or you keep him on your TV. That's important. And so, if it's a Bernie or a Biden who runs against him, ultimately as the nominee, that may be an anti-charisma kind of moment. And Biden, if you've ever spent time with him, is great, but he's not going to set you on fire like Barack Obama did. And I would say one thing about Bill Clinton, that he has more than almost any other politician, I think more than any other politician I met, it's not just his charisma that brings you in if you meet him like a Star Trek tractor beam. It's the innate way that he puts names and faces together that he shouldn't even be able to do. I've met him twice. And the first time was in 2013. Me and a friend who was working for him at the time put together a very secret meeting of Eric Cantor and Bill Clinton. And we thought we're going to have two smart guys talking about smarty smart things, and let's let them have a conversation and build a relationship, because Hillary Clinton's probably going to be president, and so we want Eric to have that kind of entree. I said 3 sentences in that meeting, 2 of which were hello and goodbye. 2 years later, I get introduced to Clinton again in Cambridge. And midway through the introduction, Clinton pushed the person aside and said, "I know Doug. Doug, how's Eric doing?" And if he hadn't already sucked me in, well, that's it. And that kind of talent just doesn't exist. And so everything that we've seen him do on a debate stage, in a speech, I saw him speak here when he spoke at I think it was the 200th anniversary of UNC. That's all great. But how he sucks in politicians is he remembers their wives' names, even though he only met them once.
Well, I can think of some people that the most colorless politician I've ever thought of meeting is Mitch Moscow McConnell. I don't think he has.
What was the adjective you used?
I don't think he has an ounce of charisma, but he is the most effective guy in America today. And there are people that have. Doug will tell you how important this is. I've seen people defeated in congressional offices, in senatorial offices, because they did not have good constituent services. And Richard Burr has excellent constituent services. And I know another U.S. senator that I admired very much. He let it get out of hand and didn't do his constituent services right, and he was defeated. So, and it wasn't much charisma there either. So you get things done one way or another. And Bill Clinton, though, may I tell one more little tiny story about?
Yeah, please do.
One time, to tell you how good he is, 2 weeks after my wife and I had stayed in the Lincoln bedroom.
It's always going to go back to that, isn't it?
My father died of brain cancer, and the phone rang in Boone. I was in Boone, and my mother had an old rotary dial phone at that time. And the phone rang and said, "This is the White House. President Clinton wants to call on Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock to speak to your mother about your father's death." So we're all waiting around that old dial telephone for the phone to ring, and the phone to ring, and it did. And the president came on in time and says, "Rufus, I want to thank you for coming and visiting me in the White House." He said it was a delightful visit, and we chatted a little bit, and he said, "Well, could I speak to your mother?" And Mama got on the phone. She's just a nice country lady. She said, "Mr. President, I want to thank you for letting Rufus and Linda spend the night with you." So like went out to cousin Charles Michael's house, spent the night with him. and she also said, "I want to thank you for helping make my other boy, Baker, a U.S. Marshal." And I won that one over Jim Hunt, by the way. I was real tickled about being able to do that. And it's wont to happen in most country homes when someone dies. Somebody's always coming by bringing a cake or a pie. There's a knock on the door. "Knock, knock, knock. Ain't Nell, this is Cousin Ruben Michael. Got a cherry pie." Mama was talking to the president. She said, "Goodbye, Mr. President. I got to go. Ruben Michael's doing the pie. Goodbye." and I grabbed the phone before it went all the way down. And I said, "Mr. President, I'm sorry my mama hung up on you like that." And he said, "Well, that'd be just something like my mother would do." And about a week later, I said, "Mama, do you realize that you hung up on the President of the United States of America?" She says, "Well, Ruby Michael was at the door with the pie." What else can you say?
It was honest.
Thank you for listening to The Road to Now. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell the world by giving us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or 5 stars on Spotify. Or spread the word directly. Just text a friend maybe, or share a link on social media. Anything helps and we appreciate it. And if you've got a friend who hasn't gotten into podcasts yet, let them know they can hear us every weekend on SiriusXM's POTUS channel 124. Now is the time when we say our special thanks to our supporters on Patreon and give a shout out to our Washingtonians. That list is Tanya Marsh, Mary Hawking, Tim and Caitlin Wells, Fig White, Matt Williams, Team Martin, Ann Williams and Frank Edwards, Nate Farrer, Jennifer and Magnolia, Chris and Teresa Adams, Joy Avery, Edward Carlson, and Aaron and Derek Garrison. Thanks to all you guys for supporting us. If you want to support our work and maybe get on that list, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/theroadtonow. You'll get extended versions of select conversations, extra episodes, bonus materials, and more. That's all available at patreon.com/theroadtonow. For more on the show, visit our website, theroadtonow.com, where you can easily search our back catalog and quickly find links to content. Why is it so good? 7 Ages Design. That's who made it. If you're looking for a website, go check them out. The Road to Now is hosted and produced by Bob Crawford and me, Ben Sawyer. Our associate producer is Gary Fletcher. This episode was edited by Gary Fletcher, and our theme music, like pretty much always, was by Paul DeFiglia. For Bob Crawford, this is Ben Sawyer. Thank you for listening. Take care.